Thanks for inviting an Anglican to gatecrash your Methodist party. When I was in my 30s, I lived in Gwendolyn Avenue in Putney, and there was a Methodist church at the bottom of the road, but I was never in it because I didn't know what a Methodist was. In my 40s, I lived at Westcott House across from Wesley House and was never out of it because it was a place of refuge for me, and I worked very closely with Jane. In my 50s, I now supervise district chairs, superintendents, and find myself invited to conferences in Blackpool. Who knows, by my 60s, I might be approved, recognised, or simply certified. When I told my mother I was coming, she said this: "You've got a good heart, son, but your mouth gets you into lots of trouble." So having forewarned you of the risks you're taking in having me, I want to ask you to attend to the wisdom of neither me nor Jane nor anybody else that you've probably heard of in terms of reflective practice, but perhaps the guru of reflective practice and supervision. And it's this guy, Bruce Lee, martial arts expert and philosopher extraordinaire, who says, "Absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, and add what is specifically your own." That should be on every conference hall wall. I wish it was. So as we go through this process this afternoon, I hope you'll do just that. You'll absorb what's useful, you'll discard what's useless, and you'll add that which is useful to you particularly. The slide says there's no such thing as a view from nowhere. Have you considered where your worldview comes from? So it seems only fair that I tell you where I'm coming from this afternoon. And where I'm coming from in being here is sheer delight. Sheer delight that you've gone back to basics and chosen the theme talking of God, talking about God in this conference. Because over the years I've been to plenty clergy conferences, and to be quite honest, despite the fancy titles, the fancy logos, the fancy publicity, they've often had an air of desperation about them and an air of drivenness about them. Many of the conferences I've been to over the years might have really been as well called church in crisis. Or, more poetically, the tunnel at the end of the light. Since the effect they've had on me as a participant and on many who've been there seems to have been to make hard-working ministers feel even more guilty about what they're not doing, even more envious of their colleagues' success, and even more anxious about how they're going to achieve more and more with less and less when they get back home. It seems to me that institutional survival and institutional anxiety are the cancers of our time. Anxiety that the church may be dying, anxiety that we aren't getting enough vocations, anxiety that our reputation's under threat, anxiety that numbers are falling, anxiety about anxiety about anxiety. And what happens when the church buys the gospel of anxiety is that we go into overdrive and seem willing to try absolutely anything that has the remotest chance of reassuring us that we're still in control and that the church won't die yet, at least not on our watch. And so we talk about strategy planning, key performance indicators, mission, targets, goal setting, restructuring, and rationalization. We'll talk about anything except talk about God. So what a relief to be at a conference that wants to do just that. A few brave souls over the years have tried to do just that. They've tried to ward off institutional anxiety. And I want to bring two examples to you which stand out for me. See if you can guess what year they come from. The first is this: I'm clear what I want of the clergy. I want them to be people who can challenge my ideas about status and about success, and so teach me how to live independently of such drugs. I want them to be people who refuse to work flat out, since work is an even more subtle drug than status. And I want them to be people who can sit still without feeling guilty, and from whom I can learn some kind of tranquility in a society which has almost lost the art. I was shocked that was 1966. Monica Furlong talking to Anglican clergy in Yorkshire. I was 5 then. I wish she could come back and talk to the C of E PLC. Let's get back to something about talking about God. Across the Atlantic, Eugene Peterson, the man behind The Message, was also waging his own war against institutional anxiety. He's done it for many years. And just as he put the Message, the Bible, into accessible language, so here he doesn't mince his words either. Listen to what he says. Pastors have gone whoring after other gods. What they do with their time under the guise of pastoral ministry hasn't the remotest connection with what the church's pastors have done for most of 20 centuries. They are preoccupied with shopkeepers' concerns, how to keep the customers happy, and how to lure customers away from competitors down the street. He continues, they're concerned with our image and standing, with what they can measure, with what produces successful church building programs and impressive attendance charts. They do their best to fill our schedules with meetings and appointments so that there's no time for either solitude nor leisure to be with God, to ponder Scripture, or to be unhurried with another person. I don't know where that lands with you, but when I first read it, it felt like a kick in the stomach. It left me winded. It left me sore. And when I got my breath back, it made me defensive. I wanted to argue it's not like that in the UK. That's okay for you over there, but it's not like that over here. But if I'm really honest, I think I had such a big reaction because it's true. It's been true in my ministry at times. It's been true in my denomination too often. And it's been true in my work across the churches in this country, New Zealand and Australia. It seems to me as if a new era of Pelagianism has replaced Pentecost. Pelagianism is pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Pentecost is the promiscuous outpouring of grace. Which will you choose? It seems to me that the churches have signed up to the gospel of scarcity rather than to the gospel of abundance. And when that happens, survival takes over from flourishing, efficiency is given a higher value than fidelity, and mastery nudges mystery out of the way. The gospel of scarcity starts out fairly innocuously when ministers say, we don't have enough. But it very quickly slides into, we can't do enough, before leaving them believing that the problem not lies so much with resources, we don't have enough, or we can't do enough with our time and skills, but the problem lies with us. We are not enough. And given the gospel of scarcity, it's no wonder that clergy morale is so low. It's no wonder that disillusionment is so rife. And it's no wonder that cynicism is so prevalent. In the course of my own ministry over nearly 4 decades now, I've seen the church respond to the gospel of scarcity in different ways. In the 70s and 80s, we seemed to have fought off our feelings of not being in control of ministry by sending everyone inwards. Counselling in the 70s was the answer. Interiority, spiritual direction. Everybody seemed to go inwards, and if only we went further inwards, the church would survive. And some people went the extra mile and added on Myers-Briggs or Enneagram or anything else they could find. And despite the journey and despite the benefits, and there have been benefits, many of us have been left thirsting for something older, wiser, longer, something that's been around an awful lot longer, that speaks to the soul. So if the 70s and 80s centres inwards, the 90s centres outwards. Suddenly, what the church needed was to learn from the world of business. And with plenty of business folks in our congregations and our church councils and our connectional communities and committees, we learned a whole new vocabulary, and we acquired various toolkits which would enable us to conduct church audits, 5-year plans, MDRs, and so on. And again, much of what we learned continues to be and has been helpful. But folks, when the hallowed language of faithfulness and discipleship takes second place to the in-language of SMART goals and performance indicators, then it's no wonder that many of us who want to live by an older story go away sad, like the rich young man in Mark 10. So what a relief to be at a conference that invites us to talk about God rather than about ourselves. What a relief to be at a conference that invites us to talk about grace rather than our next sweaty project. What a relief to be at a conference that invites us to talk about God's abundance rather than human scarcity. And what a relief to be at a conference that calls us to have our hearts and minds conformed, not according to the mindset of counselling, not according to the mindset of business, but according to the mind and heart of Christ, and to bend the knee to him and not to the prevailing culture of anxiety and of fear. In short, what a relief to be at a conference that fundamentally says our hope is in the Lord, not our hope is in ourselves. Now, I know from personal experience that when the Methodist Church first introduced supervision, it felt to many of you that it was just yet another sign of the managerial takeover of the church. The latest in a relentless torrent of things to fit in. Yet another demand on your time, one more box to tick. And one more sign that the folks in Marylebone Road were completely out of touch with just how full-on ministry is at the coalface. But it was worse than that, in my experience, because you introduced supervision so closely tied to the past cases review that what many of you told me in the early days was that despite the language of the three-legged stool, there's a remembrance for some of you, in which every leg is balanced, supervision under the Methodist Church policy felt to many of you more to do with meeting the normative needs of the denomination than the restorative needs of the individual minister. So what I heard you say was, this is snoopervision, not supervision. This is big brother, big sister watching over, not watching with. I heard you tell me it was microvision, not supervision. More a form of institutional surveillance than a meeting of visionaries who watch over each other in love. And that's why my second reason for being delighted to be here is because if supervision is to be true to its name, super and vision, then we need to get beyond compliance. We need to get beyond fear. We need to get beyond the perception that it's just yet another millennial response to institutional anxiety. And we need to reclaim a theological understanding of supervision as a place in which disciples reconnect with the vision that has claimed their lives. Now, by God, that's super. If you can reconnect with the vision that's claimed your life, you are doing supervision. If you are ticking a box, you are doing microvision. And let's call it that. Let's call it snoopervision. So there's something about recovering supervision as a place where a disciple is able to say, how are they taking care of the gift they've received, which was given for others? Our vocations, folks, are deeply personal, for sure. but our vocations are deeply public. They don't belong to us. They were given to us to be given away. Supervision asks the question, how are you giving the gift away? How are God's people benefiting from what you are doing and how you're doing it? So I'm going to pause there and ask you two questions. Is the supervision you receive micro or super? Is it characterized by vision or is it characterized by compliance? And what about the supervision you provide? Is that super or is that micro? Is it the meeting of visionaries? Super visionaries? People caught by a vision of life in Christ? Or is it an exercise in compliance? And if either what you offer or what you get is less than super and less than visionary, what are you willing to do to change it? I've been thinking and writing about supervision for about 20 years, but it suddenly all made sense to me last March when I was on the train to work. It was during Lent, and I decided to spice up my spiritual life by trying Visio Divina. If you've ever heard of Lectio Divina, you know what I mean. Visio Divina. Lectio Divina, you immerse yourself in a text and ask God to reveal God's self to you by speaking. Visio Divina is the very same thing, except for it's visual. So I asked God, I said, I want to get holy by the end of Lent. I've got 40 days to get there. Feed me things to look at. Feed me experiences. So this was day 2, it was a Thursday. I'd only been practicing it for 2 days, so I got on the train, and a woman came and sat opposite me, plunked down a rucksack on the table between us with this slogan, inspiring people to care about the planet. I said, well, fair enough, Lord, but I was looking for something a bit stronger, something a bit more inspiring. I'm up for creation, I'm up for all that, but I was looking for something a bit more. Then she peeled off her coat, and she was wearing a T-shirt with this slogan, on Wednesdays, we smash patriarchy. Okay, Lord, thank you. Now you're talking. Wow, I was asking, and he was talking. But she wasn't finished. Once she'd settled in her seat, she took out of her rucksack a bright orange book with this title, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a... Well, well, well. Visio Divina, count me in, Lord. This woman was clearly somebody who stood for something. Someone who'd no shortage of convictions. And someone who'd no hesitation in telling the world about those convictions. And there she was, sitting opposite me on a train, a priest in mufti, giving away nothing about my convictions, and bearing witness to nothing more than that particular day, a bit like today almost, North Face, Levi's, and Georgia Asda. I was fascinated by this woman, and I wanted to engage her in conversation about her beliefs, but it was a Wednesday. And I was a bloke, and I didn't feel like getting smashed. I wanted to know the story behind the T-shirt. I wanted to know, was she on her way to a political demo, or did she just wear clothes like this every day to work? I also wanted to know whether she had a T-shirt for the other days of the week. And if she had one for Sunday, what did that one say? And what about the book? Did she really not give a beep? Or, as I suspected, was she somebody who gave a beep about an awful lot of things, which is actually what the book's about, because I had to go and buy it, didn't I? I was still taking all this in when, at the next stop, a man got on and sat beside her, peeled off his coat. He was wearing a railway uniform. He opened a Bible and began to read from Matthew 21, Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem and the cleansing of the temple. And he was using his iPhone to look up the Isaiah references, the prophets' references in that text. And there I was, between them, taking it all in, soaking it all up, wondering what message I was supposed to receive and what message I was failing to give. It reminded me of that song, do you know it? Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, here I am, stuck in the middle with you. And I sat there in awe of what was unfolding right in front of my eyes. And I didn't want to stare. Actually, I did want to stare. I didn't want to get caught staring. You can't stare at a woman's chest on a train and then when you're arrested tell them you're a priest. It's been done before. So I did what I always do on the train. I opened my phone to read the lectionary text allocated to that particular day. And completely out of context, but these were the verses. Take care and be earnestly on your guard, not to forget the things which your eyes have seen, nor let them slip from your memory as long as you live, but teach them to your children and to your children's children. Wow. 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 Take care not to forget the things your eyes have seen. Don't let them slip from memory. Pass them on from generation to generation, even the book title. And as I thought about what was unfolding before me on the train, I began to make connections with why I was on the train. I was on my way to Glasgow to see 7 ministers in a row for supervision. People like the woman with the T-shirt and the ScotRail guy with his Bible. People of deep conviction who were trying their hardest to live out those convictions in their public lives, not just in their private lives. Against all the constraints, against all the realities of less than ideal appointments, less than ideal congregations, and less than ideal work settings. And it was that taught me the greatest lesson I've ever learned about pastoral supervision, which I think is actually about a courageous dialogue between soul and role and context. 20 years ago, when I used to see ministers who would come to see me, more often than not, it was because of some wound in the soul, something that wasn't quite alive, something that wasn't quite fresh. And so they reported things like leading other people in prayer, but not really praying themselves. Breaking bread for others, but not finding themselves nourished and nurtured in their own hunger. And the very honest ones told me that they raided Scripture for sermons, but never quite heard the good news spoken directly to them. What I've seen in more recent years is something far more nuanced. Something that I'm going to call vocational wounding. Wounds which arise daily in the struggle to find a way to express your soul within the demands of the role and the realities of the context. Struggles to express the soul within the demands of the role and the realities of the context. And by soul, I mean a person's motivational impulse. What gets them out of bed in the morning? What makes them tick? What's the fire in their belly that's alight sometimes and flickers at other times? What's the wee pilot light if you've got gas boilers like I have? What's that wee pilot light inside? That's what I'm talking about for soul. That lady on the train with the T-shirt had bucket loads of soul. She was certainly very, very highly motivated. She certainly wasn't short of reasons to get out of bed in the morning. And she had a very strong sense of vocation. And she was upfront and unashamed about it. She reminded me of Buchner's comment about vocation. He writes, "Vocation is the place God calls you, where your deepest gladness and the world's deepest hunger meet." And when that happens, folks, I think we experience harmony, we experience congruence, we experience well-being. But being soulfully motivated is only one part of the equation, because as we all know, roles limit as well as enable. Roles release as well as mind. If that woman's role, the woman with the t-shirt, if that woman's role was in the field of women's equality, or more generally social justice, then the chances are when she got off the train and got to work, her soul and her role would be aligned. But what if she worked in some capitalist jobs for the boys' place? What if she worked in some business conglomerate which was diametrically opposed to what made her tick? What would happen then? I wonder how she'd manage the tug of war inside with the world outside. I wonder how she'd manage it, especially if her mortgage and her bill paying depended upon it. What happens inside with that tug of war? And you and I, folks, will know people whose souls were ablaze in one role, but whose pilot light went out in another role. I think of teachers like my sister, who were absolutely vocational teachers, in their element in the classroom, but now isolated and imprisoned in the head teacher's office. I think of ministers who were very happy in circuit or diocese life and promotion. Something died. Something's not as fresh as it once was. I think of clergy torn down the middle between what they would naturally want to do in terms of responding to pastoral situations from their guts and what the requirements of the role asks them to do. And if soul and role demand careful negotiation, so too does context. Context has a massive impact on whether your soul and role have any chance of being in harmony in the workplace, in the ministry context, or not. Again, you will know people, as I do, whose souls and roles were in harmony in one appointment, but utterly discordant in another. Why? Because of toxic relationships. That's a context issue. Because they didn't feel trusted. That's a context issue. Because they felt under scrutiny. That's a context issue. Because they were told they had to perform more with less and less. That's a context issue. I've been a full-time chaplain in 3 hospices over my life. In the first 2 hospices, I had the exact same soul and role. The same job was to be with patients, staff, carers. In 2 of those hospices, I flourished because I was trusted. In the 3rd, it felt as if my wings had been surgically amputated by a culture of organisational bullying and a culture of lording it over the staff. Oh, the rhetoric was right. We had it on the wall, person-centred care, but it wasn't the staff's experience. Context has a massive bearing on whether somebody's happy, fulfilled in ministry, or dying inside and actually wishes they'd never got ordained. I've heard people say that many times. So having separated soul and role and context out, let me give you 2 examples which will help you hopefully understand what I'm talking about. Figure out what lights your fire, then go and find a match. That could be Nick's mantra, because what lights Nick's fire, what keeps his soul ablaze, is seeing children and young people catch the magic of the gospel. When children come to know Jesus, Nick's soul comes alive. His sending church had a thriving children's ministry, and during his time at theological college, he did a lot of detached youth work. But he's in his first appointment now in a church which has very few kids. Thankfully, there's an inter-church youth group on a Friday in a local cafe, and Nick's got involved. In supervision, Nick tells you he looks forward to Friday much more than he looks forward to Sunday. His heart and soul are in the Friday youth work. He admits with great honesty that he'd rather not have a Sunday, but he's a Methodist. He's been sent. He also tells you he'd rather been sent somewhere that had kids, since that's his gifting. But he went where he was asked to go. After a few months ticking the boxes in supervision, telling you enough to keep his nose clean, snoopervision, he surprises himself and he surprises you by telling you that it was a mistake to get ordained. He was much freer as a layperson to do what he felt called to do by Jesus. And as his supervisor, you realize that Nick's soul needs are not being met in his role and in his context. And that's why he's so unsatisfied in ministry. Another example. Jill's an experienced minister. She's 2 years into a new appointment and in the church profile, the people of Auchtermuchty Methodist Church, ask Eddie where that is. It doesn't exist, but it's a nice name. Said that they wanted to expand. They wanted to reach out to the community. They wanted to put their halls and community buildings to better use rather than have them locked up all week. And since Jill has a real passion for church without walls, she was delighted to be stationed there. It seemed, for the first time in her life, that the slipper fitted. But by the time her first MDR comes round, the church halls are being well used by a range of community groups. There's a pram service in the hall on a Monday, Messy Church on a Tuesday, and a dementia cafe on a Wednesday and a Thursday. But the Sunday congregation hasn't changed one bit. In meetings with the Sunday congregation, Jill finds herself increasingly asked why she spends so much time with them, those who use the buildings in the week, and not with us, the worship group on a Sunday. Jill's inevitably disappointed. She's busting a gut, doing what the congregation said they wanted, and now she feels criticised and distrusted. She sticks it out for the next year. She tries to engage the Sunday congregation with the various weekday congregations, but she gets nowhere. Dispirited and disillusioned, she comes to you and says, I want to curtail my appointment. But in supervision, her superintendent wonders aloud whether what Jill is actually talking about is her struggle to express her soul. In this case, it's a passion for those beyond the walls, with her role as minister and with her context in a place which sabotages its own stated aims and desires. And as a result, Jill is able to better understand what's going on, press the pause button on her request to curtail, and think of ways of moving forward in having the open rather than the internalized conversation. I hope those two examples give you a sense of what I mean when I say that supervision intentionally fosters the dialogue between a person's soul, their actual role, and the realities of their context. I also hope it gives you a sense of the courage and trust it takes on both sides to have conversations like that, which go far, far deeper than attending to normative issues of compliance and governance, and lean far more towards an accompanied process of transformative insight. Anything less is neither super nor visionary. And so if you were to incorporate a soul role context approach to the supervision you offer, you might like to explore questions like this. How are your soul and role faring in your present ministry? How does what you're required to do as a minister, in other words, your role, sit with your deepest values, in other words, your soul? How does your context inhibit or release you for others in ministry? And when you're up against it, and when you can't reconcile all three, soul, role, and context, which do you default to? Soul, role, or context? When up against it, in my experience, those who default to soul, to the neglect of role and context, often act out of a very privatized sense of vocation. They fly solo. They do their own thing. And while they're happy to take a stipend from the Methodist Church, they behave as if they'd ordained themselves. They don't really let the church figure much in their self-understanding. They talk the language of my ministry, my plans, my people. And when push comes to shove, they really want to be left alone and do their own thing. So not surprisingly, when they come to supervision, they present as reluctant, resistant. They're really only open to be watched over in love if it means you agree with me. That's not supervision. There's nothing super about it, nothing visionary about it. Whereas those who default to role when they can't reconcile all three, those who default to role when the going gets tough, are those who get the job done, no matter what the cost is to themselves. But these are people who often feel a dissonance between their inner and their outer selves. They feel unfulfilled inside, but they present a brave face and a cheery Christian smile to the world. Role-based folks, in my experience, are usually very diligent. They're very reliable. They're very dutiful. And they're often rewarded with promotion. So there'll be tons of you here. But unless role-based ministers can find ways to bring their soul's motivation into conversation with the job they do, they're very likely to feel unfulfilled and disappointed in ministry. And this is nothing to do with believing and not believing in God. This is to do with taking seriously vocations land in places with people which impact positively and negatively. So in my experience, what role-based ministers tend towards are one of two things. They either overwork in the day job in the hope that somehow, someday, their soul's joy will return, or that they accept that the day job won't do that, and they compensate for the lack of fulfillment it brings by taking on responsibilities elsewhere. Role-based people are very likely to do further study, to be on committees, to be on national initiatives, to be on personal interest groups, finding ways that speak to the soul if the day job doesn't allow that to do that. Of course, those whose soul gets a chance to do that, great, they do it anyway. So picking up on the conference title, what I'm saying is that when the supervisory conversation is about the dialogue between the soul, the role, and the context, whether you're sitting there as the supervisor or as the supervisee, then I think we can confidently say that we are talking about God in supervision. God, the one who stirs the soul, provides the deepest motivation. God, the one who got the longing going in the first place. God, the one for whom our hearts are restless. But also God, the one who has called us into our roles, the posts, the vocations that we hold, which are anything, as I say, but anything but private. And God, the one who's called us to do God's thing in God's church and not my thing in my church. And God, the one who's present, incarnate and active in every context, and who makes even the most uncompromising, the most unattractive appointment an opportunity for grace. The Methodist supervision policy started off at the normative end of things. You were asked as ministers to take up accountability in your ministry through a performative lens. And along the way, as trust has grown and more ministers have experienced supervision, more and more of you tell me that the restorative end is actually where you're getting the benefit. But as an Anglican who's cheered you on from the sidelines for years, I want you to go beyond just the normative, the formative, and even the restorative. I want you to hang out for the transformative dimension of supervision, which is going to give you what I'm going to call the A-list. The first A is awake. Supervision, which is super and visionary, helps people wake up. The slide says, sleep doesn't help if your soul is tired. And if the church wants a tomorrow, then we need ministers whose souls are awake, alert, today, in ways that don't allow anxiety to eclipse grace, in ways that don't allow scarcity to overtake abundance, and in ways which don't allow effectiveness to replace faithfulness. Good supervision should help you not sleepwalk your way towards your own demise. But good supervision should also help you be more attentive. One writer puts it recently, we live our lives between the twin poles of incarnation and resurrection. Incarnation asks us to get involved. Resurrection asks us to transform. Supervision should make us more attentive, help us to discern where is the call for transformation in my soul, in my role, in my context. And how do we discern between those ego-driven preferences, which is actually about me doing my thing for my church, and God's call in this particular place and in this moment, in those very unglitzy missional invitations that have God's sweaty fingerprints all over them every day. The third claim I want to make for supervision, based on a dialogue between soul, role, and context, is that it should make us more agile. The Gospels are full of stories, aren't they, where Jesus says, "Come follow me," and those who are called immediately get up and follow. My experience, 37 years in ministry, is we tell God, "Your call is important to us, please hold. We'll get back to you. We'll have a committee, we'll have a conference, we'll write a report, we'll have a proper process." What supervision should be able to do is help us respond in the agile missional moment. If we keep waiting, we'll miss the moment. If we keep needing to go to supervision to reflect on action, we will be living out entirely of hindsight. Mission requires insight. Supervision helps us to reflect in the moment as it's happening. And finally, my last claim is that supervision that takes soul, role, and context seriously takes us into something which is to do with audacity. According to this slide, audacious faith is not passive. Neither is audacious prayer. Every aspiration you have in prayer needs an accompanying action. Otherwise, you're not really praying. You're just pontificating. You do the natural. Trust God for the super. So, in summary, supervision, most important word. Supervision, in contrast to microvision, is neither cautious, nor timid, nor risk-averse, but audacious. Audacious, not just courageous, audacious. Helping people minister not just from a place of competence, but from a place of intimacy with God. And that's quite different. You know when somebody's speaking to you from intimacy with God, or whether they're talking out of a book that they've read. Intimacy with God. And I think when supervision does that, when it brings together all the things we're talking about today, I think we can be assured that we're talking about God. And I think we should be assured we'll be able to hear God in the conversation.